world following the Industrial Revolution. This is about an hour, 15 minutes.
Good evening. How's everybody doing tonight? Everybody's awake, I hope, not freezing. My name's Elise Cato, and I'm the Director of Community Programs at the World Affairs Council. Chinese firms, many that are state-owned, are going global, in case you haven't figured that out by now. They're purchasing commodities, investing resources, and accessing foreign markets. China has become one of the top investors in Africa, South America, and Eastern Europe, the top foreign holder of U.S. debt, and is speculated to be buying up a record quantities of gold. With a limited amount of resources on the line, what does China's race for resources mean for the rest of the world? For 60 years, the World Affairs Council has worked to inspire global understanding and engagement in Greater Seattle through programs with teachers and students, through bringing delegates to meet with local community members and organizations, and through public programs like this one tonight. Our programs are made possible through sponsorships and community partnerships, and we would like to thank tonight's sponsor, Microsoft, for their support. We would also like to thank our co-presenters for their promotional support, and they include the Greater Seattle Chinese Chamber of Commerce, the University of Washington's African Studies Program and the Evans School of Public Affairs, and Seattle University's Asian Studies and Global African Studies School of Public Affairs, and Seattle University's Asian Studies and Global African Studies programs. As we do with all of our events, in order to reach a larger audience than the one that's here tonight, we're going to be tweeting this event from WAC Seattle. The hashtag will be MoyoWAC, M-O-Y-O-W-A-C. So if you're on Twitter, follow, join, ask questions, engage. We believe that dialogue and discussion are critical to developing a better understanding of the world, and I invite you to participate in the conversation. We will be doing open Q&A for tonight's event, and we have volunteers who will be passing around a wireless microphone. We do also have note cards available if you'd prefer to write down your question and pass it to a volunteer to ask for you. Moderating tonight's Q&A will be Dr. Anand Yang, Professor of International Studies and History at the University of Washington. Between 2002 and 2010, he was the director of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies. Prior to joining the University of Washington, he taught at Sweetbriar College and at the University of Utah, where he was chair of the history department and subsequently director of its Asian Studies program. Dr. Yang was born in India of Chinese parents, grew up and attended school in New Delhi, and then finished high school in Mexico City before moving to the United States to attend college. So truly an international citizen joining us tonight. With that, a quick introduction of our speaker. Dambisa Moyo is an international economist who focuses on the macroeconomy and global affairs. She is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Dead Aid, Why Aid is Not Working, and How There is a Better Way for Africa. She also just let me know that her new book, it just hit the bestseller list yesterday, I believe. In 2009, Ms. Moyo was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. She is regularly published in the Financial Times, The Economist magazine, and the Wall Street Journal. She completed a PhD in economics at Oxford University and holds a master's degree from Harvard University. Please join me in welcoming Dambisa Moyo to the stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Is it obvious? Got it. Hello, good evening. I'm not too sure I like the idea of MoyoWAC. I think that sounds a bit... Maybe the fact that they've dropped the is whack, maybe I should feel a bit better. But in any case, it's a pleasure to be back in Seattle, although I have to say this is the first time of many, many visits here that it is absolutely freezing cold. So I'm a bit disappointed about that. But thank you to Microsoft and to the hosts, World Affairs Council. Really appreciate the opportunity to be back here and the opportunity to be able to speak to you about what I think is the most important issue that we will be facing in the decade to come, which is commodity scarcity. I originally had not planned to use slides because I think that it can sort of belabor the issue. But actually, in retrospect and thinking about it some more, I have some slides that I think are pretty fantastic and illustrate a lot of what the story is. So I hope you'll indulge me, and I also hope that you will be engaged enough and interested enough to push back and ask questions during the Q&A. In terms of what I'd like to do this evening, I would like to basically break the discussion into three parts. First of all, I'm going to spend a bit of time giving you a global snapshot of where demand and supply of the resources, land, such as arable land in particular, water, energy and minerals are, so that we can, when we discuss what China is doing, it is set in the context of where global demand and supply pressures are. And then secondly, I would then focus specifically on what China's specific demand and supply pressures are. And again, I think that will be a good lead-in to sort of going from the aggregate or the macro world picture to drilling down into more specific China picture. Me?
Take that over just a little bit more.
Okay. There we go. Is that better? Okay. And then finally, I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about ongoing issues. I guess I've classified this into two areas. I will spend time specifically detailing China's three-pronged approach to securing resources around the world. And then I will spend a little bit of time talking about some of the more controversial issues, things like the charges of neocolonialism, labor and environmental issues that China is often accused of, use of prisoners and so on, to sort of motivate the discussion of where I think there might be a lot of misinformation. But in any case, I hope you enjoy the evening, and I hope that we'll have an opportunity to speak some more about what's going on around the world. So I'm going to start off on the demand side, the global demand picture. There are three key aspects, or key three factors that are driving global demand. The first one, as you can see from this slide here, is the global population. The world population, roughly about 7 billion today, is expected to skyrocket to 9 billion people on the planet by 2050. You can also see from the pictures that I have in front of you that a lot of that demand pressure will be coming from the emerging markets. Today, almost 90% of the world's population lives in the emerging world, and that trend will continue with only roughly 12% of the world's population living in developed economies. I want to state very clearly and upfront that this population growth is actually an aberration. It's something that has not been seen in historical context, and actually many sociologists and demographers believe that it will not be seen again after we plateau out at around 10 billion people on the planet by 2100. I really like this quote, and if you'd indulge me, I'm going to read it. It's by a sociologist. I don't know whether he'd call himself a sociologist, but anyway, John Durand, I think, is a sociologist with some demographic leanings, but his statement was as follows: "The extraordinary proliferation of the human species cannot fail to be recognized as one of the principal features of modern world history. In historical perspective, it appears as a unique episode in the growth of the species since its origin. It has no parallel in previous history or prehistory for the speed and magnitude of expansion of numbers, and it seems highly unlikely that a comparable expansion will occur again in the future after the present trend has run its course." I state this, or reiterating, this is from 1966, because what we are dealing with now is a very unique set of circumstances. In the 1950s and 1960s, the population of the world was 3 billion. We're now at 7. And as I mentioned, we'll be going to 9 and possibly 10 by 2100. So very, very unique circumstances, and this is why it's so important to understand what this means for the world. The second key aspect, or key factor driving demand, is global wealth. So not only are we getting larger in terms of population, but a lot more people are becoming wealthier. The estimates are that we will have an additional 3 billion new people in the world's middle class by 2030, which is just around the corner. So it's really, really is important to look at how those people who would like to live like us in this room, in the sense that they would like to live like, to achieve Western standards of living, how those demand pressures will be felt on the global resource supply. As you can see from the slide presented here, a lot of that demand pressure from wealth will be largely felt from the growing middle classes in places like Asia and Africa. But you can also see that places like Eastern Europe will also have large increases in the middle class. The third key aspect of demand pressure is urbanization. And a lot of people will be aware that the Chinese in particular have embarked on a large, very systematic program to urbanize more rapidly. I put this chart up here just to illustrate for you how significant urbanization, not only for China, but also for the rest of the emerging world. You can see from this chart that although there are almost 100 cities in China that have 1 million plus citizens living there, the United States only has 9 cities like that, Europe only 18. The emerging world, more generally, is going to be the place where we will see much more urbanization, whether you're in Mexico City, in Lagos, or many of the cities in Asia. The world expects by 2030 to have 3 billion new urbanites, 2 billion new urbanites, moving the number from 3 billion urbanites today up to 5 billion people living in urban areas. The pressures on commodities are enormous, as people expect to have indoor plumbing, mobile phones, better buildings, but also in terms of agriculture produce, because as we know, people who live in urban areas expect to have clean running water through the taps, but also to have better quality food. So again, a massive driver in terms of where we see pressures for resources. So I've talked about the population growth, I've talked about wealth increases, and I've talked about urbanization. These are the 3 key drivers on the demand side. Let's take a look at what's happening on supply. I mentioned earlier that there are 4 categories of supply or across the commodity index complex that I think are interesting: arable land, water, energy, and minerals. And let me, for a few moments, quickly go through some of the key aspects that characterize the supply of these different assets from a global perspective. Land, there are about 13 billion hectares of land, which is equivalent to about 16 times the size of the United States. However, only 11%, about 1.4 billion of that land, is arable. And in that sense, where you can grow food. One of the things that we tend to take for granted is that we are not only fighting for arable land amongst ourselves as human beings, but also animals and plants also need to thrive and exist on arable land. And more than that, as you know, a lot of the arable land that we do have access to is not being used to grow crops. What do I mean by that? A lot of the urban areas that are built are actually built on arable land. And we take that for granted. We're not living on deserts. And so the amount of arable land, as we start to see the population continue to rise significantly, will basically see pressures of more people living on smaller patches of arable land. Water is a key challenge for the next decade. Just 2 months ago, the United States Department of Intelligence, and I will give you the quotes later, announced in a report that they fear that some of the biggest water wars in the world, some of the biggest wars to come in the world over the next several decades will be around water. I will talk more about conflict, but suffice it to say that as we stand here or sit here today, there are 25 wars that are raging around the world that have their origins in commodities. We expect that there will be many more because of this freshwater shortage. To put it into context, 70% of the world, of the earth, is water. However, less than 1% of that water is actually available or is of the quality for us to use for not just drinking and sustenance, but also just for sanitation. Less than 1%. And as you can imagine, a lot of that water is also very difficult to access. It's in mountain caps, and it's in difficult places such as rivers that are not so easily accessible. So water, a massive, massive problem, and big shortages expected. Energy, If you live in Western countries, this is sort of the big hook. Everybody talks about energy prices when they breach $4 a gallon. If you think about, and later on we'll talk about policy issues and as they pertain to commodities shortages. But if you think about it, if you go to the emerging world, water is a much bigger issue than energy. There are places like India, places across Africa where water is rationed. You have access to water for a couple of hours a day. And a lot of the political dynamics in those countries are driven much more by water, whether the demand or supply of water versus sort of energy, which would probably be the bigger hook in a place like the United States. Just to put a finer point on this, whereas in the United States you turn on a tap, you would never expect there to be no water or dirty water coming out of your tap. But in many places in the emerging world, that is the case. People turn on taps and water doesn't come out, or it comes out and it's not of a quality that can be used. Water pressure is a very big deal in the years to come. And I mentioned energy in Western countries, also a big deal. Just to really underscore the energy point, we are living today on energy finds that were made in the 1950s. Discoveries of the 1950s. With all the information we have about the world, the greater integration that has occurred, the ability of new technologies, we are still living off of discoveries from the 1950s. And for me, I think that was one of the biggest surprises that I found and encountered in doing research for this book. Finally, minerals. People don't really spend a lot of time talking about minerals, but they really impact pretty much every aspect of our life today, whether it's computers, this microphone, mobile phones, the amount of minerals in terms of copper, whether it's iron, steel, that is actually used in our day-to-day comforts, or what they call white goods as economists, is enormous. However, it's becoming more and more difficult to access those resources. Companies are having to go to much more difficult terrain to get access to these resources, and more than that, they're having to go to more politically volatile regions of the world. And I have a couple of slides to show you what I mean. On the energy point, I made this point a minute ago. You can see from the diagram there, the 1950s, where the blue bars are, is when we last saw some massive discoveries of energy and fossil fuels. You can see as we go towards 2050 that has plummeted very significantly. It's worth stating here that you do hear every now and then people say, oh gosh, we just had this massive discovery. One of my favorites is the Tupi oil fields off of Brazil. But the fact of the matter is, if you talk to people who are in the industry, a lot of those oil finds are not new. They've known about those oil finds, the difficulty is being able to access them. I say the Tupi one in Brazil is my favorite because there were big announcements. They found 100 billion barrels of oil. This was a couple of years ago. And the price of oil actually went down because people thought we were going to be flooded with supply. That oil supply in Tupi in Brazil is under 2 miles of salt. And even with the technology we have today, we're simply not able to access it. The estimates are that it could cost over $500 billion to get access to that oil. So you can imagine how difficult it is. And I should also point out that every year, numerous people die in accessing these resources, and we don't seem to really appreciate that. I find it shocking that oil is only about $100 a barrel. It sounds very expensive to us, but given the capital expenditures that go into these projects and the number of people who die, it's a very, very expensive business, and it is a very challenging business also. I made the point earlier about the difficulty of getting mineral resources. This chart here is just to underscore that point. You can see that over time we expect that it's going to be much harder to get resources such as copper from the existing or easy places, or we can call it the low-hanging fruit. You're going to have to go to more politically unstable places such as Congo DRC. The accident in Chile a couple of years ago with the copper mine in Chile, those types of incidents I think we'll see a lot more from, because you not only have to go to more difficult political environments, but also the terrain and the depths of the earth that people have to go to access these resources are becoming more challenging. A few other things which I've got on the side there. The quality of the copper and other minerals is getting poorer, so it's not high quality stuff. It's difficult to get really good quality. I mentioned earlier the number of discoveries is going down, geopolitical risk, escalating costs, and also fewer and fewer people are actually going into the industry of mining, choosing to go into other areas. So I've given you a very, very tragic story. Lots and lots of demand, not enough supply. The supply is scarce, it's depleting, it's finite. That is the global picture. I'd like to spend a bit of time now talking about specifically China and what it is that's behind the story of their race for resources. Again, let's start with China's demand story. 1.3 billion, 1.4 billion people of the population of China. About 300 million of those people live like us, so the standards that we've grown accustomed to here. The sort of good news, if you will, is that that population will be tapering off, so the pressures on commodities, you could argue, will be abating. However, they will have a large stock of a population, 1.4 billion people, who, by the way, are trying to live better and better lives, demanding increasing and better access to resources. So the demand picture, coming again from population growth, which is still growing in China, is still something that will continue. Wealth. Many people in this room will be aware that back in the 1820s, China and India were the largest countries as a proportion of GDP around the world. They made a few policy mistakes, cost them 300 years of economic development. We're seeing economic growth. We're seeing wealth improvements significant in the country, not just China, but also across the emerging world. That will put pressure, we talked about this already in talking about wealth, but you can see how China in particular, with the improvements in livelihoods, is going to demand increases amount of resources. Just to put a finer point on it, GDP growth, the worst estimates I'm seeing now, and people will be familiar with the story of sort of a softening, a soft landing in China. The worst estimates I'm seeing are sort of 7 to 7.5% GDP growth. Of course, over time, that number will come down. As you can see, the forecasts out to 2030 are much lower. But in the interim, as the Chinese economy continues to powerhouse along, you can expect that economic growth will translate into more wealth and therefore greater resource demand. Just again, some more indications of what's going on here. Consumption is a very interesting piece of the story here. Traditionally, China's economy has focused on investment, especially led by the government. The Chinese share, private consumption share of GDP is around 30 to 35%. In the United States, consumption as a share of GDP is around 70%. And you could argue that both of those are too far out into the extremes. The US is consuming too much. China is probably not consuming enough. The government in China has very deliberate plans to increase that number, maybe to as much as 50%. And that is going to be a key driver, particularly in empowering domestic demand for greater domestic goods, such as washing machines, consumer durables, such as computers, mobile phones, cars, and so on. There are a significant number of cars now that are made in China from other international companies like BMW, and we expect that there'll be much more demand from the local economy in and across China. Urbanization. Remember, I said urbanization was a big driver globally. We said we'd have 3 billion new people coming into the urban areas by 2025. Well, here is a slide that shows you where that is in terms of China. As I mentioned earlier, the Chinese government has a very, very specific and systematic plan to move people into the urban areas. Very often for policymakers, it's easier to provide resource goods, things like education, things like healthcare, to a population that is more localized in a particular area. You can see that the expectation by 2025 is that 1 billion people in China will be living in cities. They will have over 8 cities that will have over 10 million people. I come from Zambia. Zambia has populations about 10 million, maybe 10 to 12 million people. In China, that's not even a real city, if I may say that. You have 23 cities that have 5 million people plus, and that's again very significant draw on resources, very, very deliberate decision by the government. I don't want to really belabor the urbanization point, but also very interesting is some data that we have on sensitivity of urbanization to commodity demand. So you can see on the right-hand side what China's specific sensitivity is to urbanization. And by that I mean, if you have 1 unit of urbanization, how do these commodities respond? And for pretty much every single commodity, whether it's soybeans, aluminium, cotton, sugar, copper, coal, gas, oil, for all of these resources, the sensitivity in China is much higher. And by that I mean, the more urbanization you have in China, the more demand that you have for these different resources. I won't spend too much time on the next couple of slides because they're really just emphasizing the point I've just made. More demand for air conditioners, refrigerators, and washing machines as you have more urban areas. But the one I think is quite interesting is this one here, because I'm talking a lot about metals and minerals and oil, but don't forget agriculture products also become a big factor. You can see here that China, with that little red circle around it, at its per capita income, it does not demand anywhere near as much as the United States in the top right-hand corner when it comes to the demand for meat products. And you can expect as more and more Chinese become wealthy, you will see an increase in the demand for better quality foods such as meat products, and that, once again, does put a significant amount of pressure on resources. The thing about meat products and wheat and bread and so on, I give a number of detailed examples in the book. But the interesting thing about them is that there are hidden costs of water as well, because to produce a unit of beef requires an inordinate amount of water. In the book, I have many different examples of how much water is required just to have 2 fried eggs in the morning, or to have a glass of milk. And I think it's those hidden costs which I hope when people are reading through the book will be quite surprised, but also find quite interesting. So that's the demand picture. Again, we've gone through population, we've gone through wealth, and we've gone through urbanization. We'll spend a couple of minutes now talking about the supply side in China. Can the demand pressures that I've just outlined for China specifically, can they be met by supply? And of course the answer is no, otherwise I wouldn't have written the book. So China's supply constraints. Let's start with food. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, food incredibly important. One of the biggest constraints in China is soybeans. It is a big input for the food that is consumed there. And as you can see, unlike any other food, so corn, wheat, or sugar, soybeans is one thing that the Chinese are not able to produce adequately to support the demand at home. You can see here, this is percentage of world consumption and world production. There's a massive gap. They're demanding 27% of world consumption. They're producing only 5%. This is good news for the United States in case Obama and Mr. Romney are looking for how to create jobs. Soybeans is a big production. The United States is a big producer of soybeans, but as is Brazil. The book talks a lot about some of the consequences of those decisions for you here in the US, but more generally, you can see that for China, this is a very big opportunity for them to keep importing, and they do. Water, massive problem in China. You can see China is falling below the world average in terms of water units. This has actually led to some very aggressive action by China. One of the big stories that has tended to hit the newspaper wires quite a bit is that China has been rerouting a whole river out of India, the Brahmaputra River. And there have been some public announcements by both Manmohan Singh, the Prime Minister of India, and Wen Jiabao, the Premier of China, about how they're going to try and work together. But the desperation for and the need for fresh water in China is very clear. And it's very well known that a lot of rivers are polluted, and there simply is not enough water to support the population. And this graph, I think, tells that quite clearly. Oil demand. The United States, on a per capita income basis, consumes 9 times that of China. And you can see here, the picture's not looking much better for China as time goes on. Simply not enough domestic production to meet the projections of supply, the projections of demand that China has over the next several decades. Unsurprisingly, that is a similar picture in copper. I picked copper because I think copper is the one that is the most important mineral that China does not have, but China needs. You can see here, versus mine supply, not enough copper for China. This has led China to go to very aggressively go to different regions around the world, across South America, across Africa. Places like Congo, Zambia, my own home country, have been very big targets for China's foray into the resource markets. So, as promised, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the ongoing issues. This is the picture as it stands today. And you can see probably as we've gone through the slides that we're drawing on a lot of data that's publicly available. However, even though we all pretty much know that there's some rumblings going on, we just have too many people demanding too much stuff and just not enough supply. As I said, scarce, finite, and depleting supplies. There is not an international body that deals only with commodities. And to me, I find this quite surprising. We have the World Trade Organization that focuses on trade. We have Copenhagen Consensus that focuses on the environment. The G20 is focusing now on banking regulation. But there's nobody, not one international body, focusing on what I consider to be the big issue, which is commodities, our ability to survive as a human species. Unsurprisingly, this has led to a lot of wars and a lot of conflict. I'm not going to go through this list, obviously, but just in the book, there's a couple of lists that show a number of the wars that are going on right now around the world. Some of them civil wars within country, and then there's some which are across country borders. As I mentioned earlier, the Department of Intelligence in the United States has talked already about some of the expected water wars in the years to come. But beyond that, I have a fantastic, or I think is fantastic. As I said to someone earlier, I think it probably tells you how boring my life is. But there's a database, which I've talked about in the book, which has data of the water wars going back 1,000 years. And it's fascinating because a lot of the places that are incredibly vulnerable for water wars are still in the same regions. Places like the Middle East, places in Africa, for example, where the droughts around water are more significant. I think that's quite interesting because you'll see from this list here that actually a lot of the water wars are not even really reflected on this list. So many more wars to come, I'm afraid, if we don't do something about it, which is exactly what this says. This is the statement from the National Intelligence Council from the United States, February 2012. Over the next 10 years, water shortages and government failures to manage them are likely to lead to social disruptions, pressure on national and local leaders, and potentially political instability. I won't read the second one, but it really talks about how this type of, the lack of water will be used more as leverage and could be used as a tool for terrorist organizations. So this is the picture, but not much is being done about it to the best of my understanding, except if you're China. China has adopted what I believe is a three-pronged approach to securing resources. And if you don't mind, I'll spend a few moments just explaining what I think these three key aspects are. The first one is this idea of befriending the axis of the unloved. So this is, in my mind, China going to different regions around the world that have traditionally been places that the rest of the developed world, places like the United States and Europe, have kind of ignored as investment destinations. You have to appreciate that many of these regions, places like Africa, South America, Eastern Europe, have very, very large pockets of people who are young. In Africa, 60% of the population is under the age of 24. Across the Middle East, 70% of the population under the age of 24. In countries like Uganda, 50% of the population under the age of 15. They need jobs, they need trade, they need investment, and this is really, really important because this is exactly what China can offer. So China is providing trade, it's providing investment, providing capital, building roads, and in return, these countries are very happy to mortgage off some of their resources. What I'd like to do, if you don't mind, just give you a few examples. There's a whole list of examples in the book, and it's absolutely fascinating. But let me share with you a few of them right now. A few years ago, China, 2006, bought a mountain in Peru, Mount Toromocho, bought the mineral rights to the mountain. It's half the height of Mount Everest, and they paid $3 billion for it. In Brazil, the Chinese have engaged in swaps, beef and chicken swaps, so they pay money to Brazil in the form of loans, and in return, they get access to beef and chicken. Right next door in Canada, there's been a big discussion about the new deal that has been struck between China and Canada. It's called pork for laptops. Surprising to maybe people in this room, the Chinese are supplying Canada with laptops and in return getting pork. Russia, they have 25-year swaps for oil with Russia. They're giving loans to Kazakhstan for uranium to support their nuclear programs. And my personal favorite is an infrastructure investment that China has made in Africa. The distance from Cape to Cairo, which is basically the northmost point to the southmost point of the continent, is about 3 times the distance of New York to California. It's about 9,000 miles. That whole distance is tarred. It's got a fantastic road. It will take you about 5 weeks to drive. You go through 15 countries, and as you go through one country to the next country, there are big signs, generous gift from the government of China. And of course, I hope nobody, especially not policymakers, I hope they have not missed on the fact that this is basically the trade. The Chinese will invest in your economies, but in return, they are expecting to get access to these resources. The largest recipient of foreign direct investment, particularly targeting resources, is, any guesses? It's Australia. China is basically in every country, or many, many countries around the world, as part of their campaign. The second aspect of the Chinese campaign is this idea of a zero cost of capital. Because the Chinese government is so heavily involved through state capitalism, they have basically no price control, or at least this is how market participants would view it. Who focus on Western models of finance tend to think of things through a discounted cash flow model. So we estimate that the value of this podium maybe is $100. And maybe the Chinese would walk in and say, well, we're going to pay $500 for it. Well, the reason they're paying so much more for these assets is because their utility function, their need for these resources is so much more significant than simply a return on investment or simply for profit. They need to supply food to their population, otherwise they will have a political problem. And because of that, the traditional models that we use when we think about valuing a copper mine or an oil well, I believe are kind of faulty. Of course, it helps the fact that China has a lot of money. They have saved now over $3 trillion of foreign reserves, and that is quite significant in their ability to have strong buying power. In the book, I talk about some cautionary remarks from South Korean ministers telling their own companies not to bother competing with the Chinese. If they hear that the Chinese are trying to get access to certain resources, they shouldn't bother. And one of the big competing places where the competition is really hotted up a lot is in Africa, because today Africa has the most untilled arable land left on the planet. So you can imagine with China, compared to China, which only has about 10% arable land, Africa is a very big, interesting place to gain resources. The third aspect of China's resource campaign is that she's become a monopsonist. A monopsonist is a price setter on the buying side. So we know what a monopolist is. A monopsonist would be somebody, let's take the example of a large company, a supermarket that is based in Iowa, let's say. That supermarket can set the price of what a tomato is, because all the farmers who live in Iowa are trying to sell their tomatoes to this one supermarket. And so therefore the supermarket can say, well, I'm only willing to pay you 30 cents for a tomato. And so China, in that sense, has become a monopsonist. In particular, copper and coal in the markets are already viewed as two minerals that where China has so much influence and is as the marginal buyer drives the prices of these resources. So you can imagine and you can think about how how transformational China's activities are, because we're talking about publicly traded markets where competition should be free and transparent, and here we have one buyer that is so huge that they're able to influence the price of a resource. So that is also quite a significant part. I'd like to spend a little bit of time now talking about some of the outstanding issues. And I fear that this is an issue where, this issue meaning commodity scarcity and resources, is an issue where there's not enough information that is true. There's a lot of misinformation, and I think it's to the detriment of our engagement as a world in trying to solve this very, very serious problem. And I'd like to just go through a few examples of some of the things that you hear about around the world, in particular around China's race for resources. The first one is around neocolonialism and the idea that China is actually trying to take on sovereign risk and to take over these different regions. And in the book I talk about this quite a bit, because as a political construct, and particularly as it pertains to places like Africa, I think this is completely misplaced and wrong. China is not in Africa or across South America for political gain. They have absolutely no interest in finding out what's going on politically in these countries. All they care about is the economic agenda. They've got to get these resources to fund their population. In fact, if anything, there's been a lot of criticism on the other side that China doesn't care enough about the political infrastructure, and they're willing to do deals with corrupt leaders on the ground. And I think this is a very, very interesting point that is very incorrect. And you read a lot, particularly in Western press, that China's foray into the emerging markets is a neo-colonial campaign. I disagree with that a lot. Related to that, you hear that people say, well, in places like Africa, people don't like the Chinese. The Chinese are taking advantage of Africans. I would refer you to a study that was conducted by the Pew Research Institute, an American institution. In 2007, went to Africa, to 10 countries in Africa, and this is in the book, and Senegal, Ghana, Ethiopia, a bunch of countries, and asked the Africans, what do you think about the Chinese? Do you like them? Do you hate them? Are they better or worse than the Americans? And by wide margins, I'm talking about 97%, 95%, the Africans said, we like the Chinese. They're improving our livelihoods, they're making life better, and by the way, we think they're better than the Americans. And I think that is really important, an important message to get out. I do also believe that the relationship with the Chinese is a dynamic one. If you go to places like India, you go to places like Africa, the general sentiment is pretty positive about the Chinese being there. You go to places that are more developed, the United States, which receives significant investment from the Chinese and also, as you know, is the largest lender to the United States government. The sentiment is really more laced with skepticism and a lot more concern. I do think the relationship with the Chinese is dynamic. Brazil is a good example. A few decades ago, the relationship between China and Brazil was quite amicable. If you read the literature, that relationship has become much more fractious as Brazil has become wealthier. And so the relationship is dynamic and it has many different aspects, but I think it's really misplaced to say that people are being abused and they don't like the Chinese being there. I think it's much more nuanced than that. Labor ratios, one of the big discussions that you hear is no Africans are being employed, especially, I'm talking about Africa in particular, because this is where you hear a lot of these stories. In the book, and I won't go through it here, but I have a number of projects, Chinese projects, where official statistics from the government of these different African countries, but also from government verified by Chinese resources, and also from international agencies such as the New York Times, the Guardian, Human Rights Watch. These are data that come from these different organizations, and the claim that Africans are not being employed and that they're employing Chinese workers simply unfounded. You can have a look at the ratios there. For pretty much all the projects that surveyed, many more Africans employed than Chinese. So again, one of these stories that become an old wives' tale that is very detrimental to Chinese investment in Africa and across the world, but isn't really not true. Next point is around prisoners. Another big claim you hear, oh, they're using prisoners. In a world of camera-ready mobile phones, you would think there'd be lots of evidence to show that this is the case. We've searched and searched and could not find a shred of this. Now, what I will say is that the relationship with the Chinese in Africa and across the world isn't particularly straightforward, for sure. But I mean, the case or the claim that there is a systematic or a widespread campaign to use prisoners to abuse the environment is simply not supported in the evidence. I think that there is a lot of scope to improve the relationship, and of course we should police behavior not just of the Chinese but of any investor, domestic or international, wherever they are around the world. But I think that these types of name calling and the sort of negative story that's ascribed to China is incredibly damaging, not just for Chinese investment into these regions, but also for the global approach that is needed for us to solve the big commodity shortages that we will be facing shortly. Let me just say a few points on the point 4 here, which is around unilateral versus multilateral approach. As I've gone through for you already, the Chinese approach is very multilateral and it's also very symbiotic. If you go to the emerging world, people say, we need the investment, we need the trade, otherwise we've got a political problem, so we need the Chinese to come in. And that relationship of symbiosis, where the Chinese invest money, they give money, loans, and so on, in return for the greatest access to the most important resource of these host countries, is something that the Chinese have done in an amazing fashion around the world, including here in the United States. They've given money, they've lent money, and they've had access to the most important resource in the United States, which is the US consumer. So the symbiosis that has occurred has been something that I believe has happened. I think it does work because these countries do need this investment. It's not without risk. We're talking about depleting assets. We're talking about resources that will not exist ad infinitum. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is really to encourage policymakers in these countries to be quite focused to save the money that they're getting from the Chinese, or to manage the resources much more actively. We've seen countries like Norway do it very well. It's very important that countries in these emerging markets do the same, because there is no love lost, I believe. If a mine no longer produces copper, I don't think the Chinese will hang around to stay around and continue investing in these places. Just to contrast the multilateral approach of the Chinese with that of the unilateral approach, which I would argue has been the case, particularly for places like the United States. The US campaign around the world to secure resources, such as when they went to Iraq, classic examples of unilateralism and this idea of every nation for itself. That kind of those types of incursions, I believe, in the long term don't serve us as a global community. It makes oil prices much more expensive. Every time you hear that there's a political problem in a large oil-producing country, it probably costs or adds on an additional $10 to a barrel. So it's very significant for world consumption and for the price of these resources. And I think it's probably not the most efficient way to go about solving the problem. Just a few last moment words on the way forward. There's a tendency, I believe, to talk about demand versus supply policies as solutions. Personally, I don't believe in a lot that the demand policies have a lot of sort of run room, because it's very difficult to try and convince people who live in the emerging world that they should cut back on their consumption of resources. Demand policies are things like consumption taxes, so putting taxes on the amount of energy or oil that you can use. They sound like great policies, especially with environmental concerns, but they're very, very difficult to implement in a place where you have a large part of the population living very poor lives, but would like to see significant improvements in their living standards. So as much as I understand and appreciate demand-side policies on paper, I think they're very, very difficult to implement. We consume, the world consumes 85 million barrels of oil a day. The United States is the largest consumer of oil every day. It consumes 20 million barrels of oil a day. It's even been difficult to implement policies here in the United States where there's much more information and much more savvy, many more options around energy choices. So if you're not able to implement very aggressive demand policies here, I find it very hard to believe that you'll be able to do that in the emerging world where people are only just seeing significant improvements in their lives. I think supply-side policies have much more wiggle room. Supply-side policies would be things like much more technology investment, much more investment in R&D and innovation as ways to increase supply of different resources. It could be things like improved or increased investment in things like desalination for water, which, by the way, China and Saudi Arabia are leaders in this space. I would hope that the United States would be a big leader in that space. Unfortunately, they have not been. Or things like new and different technologies around energy solutions. In the United States, fracking has become a big buzzword. People talking about the U.S. becoming energy independent. But going back to the environmental concerns, I believe that the challenges to that type of to fracking and some of the way that it's done, the toxins and the risk of subsidence to the earth, I think mean that it's really not going to provide a reprieve for energy prices. And then I put down here military spending. 2010 data, the United States spends about $700 billion on military spending around the world. It is the largest amount of money spent on military by far. The other countries, Japan, China, are second, a very distant second. One of the proposals in the book is that because so many of the wars around the world are actually commodity wars, I think even if the United States diverted just a fraction of that military spending into more resource innovation, not only would you have less wars and less risk, more peace in the world, but also a lot of the resources, I think, you wouldn't have a reason to fight because we'd find a lot of the solutions to desalination and so on that could actually solve the problems in the first place. So I think there is a lot of scope in solving these problems. I'm going to stop with this Chinese frame of mind. This is a statement from the Chinese environmental minister that came out last year. The depletion, deterioration, and exhaustion of resources and the deterioration of the environment have become serious bottlenecks constraining economic and social development. My view is that this is basically saying commodity prices are going up. We have a long, long way before we actually get to a place where the world is focused on this issue, and that's what really worries me. And I hope that you take away from this the urgency of these issues, the fact that we have so many wars around the world already, and that the intelligence community is already forecasting more wars, suggests to me that we should prioritize this, if nothing else, particularly because we do need commodities to survive. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
And motivated, can you all hear me? Is the mic on? And motivated we certainly should be for a very lively discussion, given all the ideas that Dr. Moyo has presented to us. And certainly there's a lot of food for thought here. I suppose because I'm sitting here and sort of at the edge of this podium here, I hope that's not symbolic of where Dr. Moyo has taken us. But I'm sort of thinking of the three books stitched together and thinking of the kind of narrative you really created for all your readers and all your listeners everywhere. And to some extent, there's a certain amount of gloom and doom in going from dead aid to how the West was lost to winner take all, because there are no punctuation marks there. There's sort of a finality to all of this. So where's the silver lining? And perhaps one way to make that question more concrete, because I know you do this in your book a lot, is talk about this symbiotic relationship between China and Africa, where you see, unlike most people who've written about this subject, lots of very positive things, as well as why we in sort of Euro-America should wake up and see what's happening.
Yeah, well, again, thank you. Thanks very much. Well, first of all, it is a pity that people get swept away by the main title of a book, because if you read the subtitles of all my books, they actually all are very positive. And believe it or not, I'm an optimist. I know that's hard to believe. In Dead Aid, the subtitle was, what was the subtitle? Hang on, let me think about this. The subtitle of Dead Aid was Why Aid is Not Working and How There is a Better Way for Africa. So for those of you who read the book, you will know that the first half was a critique of aid to Africa, but the second half of the book gave you a whole list of specific things that the world could do to try and improve Africa's standing in the world. My second book, How the West Was Lost, subtitle was 50 Years of Economic Folly and the Stark Choices That Ahead. Again, was a critique, but at the second half of the book was really saying, well, this is where the mistakes have been made. Here are a list of things that can be done to turn the story around. Similarly, with Winner Take All, the idea here is that China, we are playing a very serious game. You could argue it's a zero-sum game because there are a finite number of resources. China's race for resources and what it means for the world. It's really trying to articulate what it means for the world that China is doing what she's doing. My books are not meant to be doom and gloom. They're highlighting many of the unintended consequences of actions by policymakers. I won't rehash the other two books, but it was very clear that there are deliberate policy actions that occur by policymakers, and there can be negative consequences. Your question is very, very important because the role of unintended consequences or the lens of unintended consequences was a key driver in me writing this third book, Winner Take All. Because as an African, and an African who comes from a resource-rich country, I was very, very interested in what the costs or the unintended consequences of China's foray into my country would be. On the surface, looks very positive. We need the trade, we need the investment, very desperately. I didn't say this earlier, but Africa is 1 billion people. It's less than 2% of world trade. Even though Africa has got, as I mentioned earlier, the largest amount of untilled arable land in the planet, is a leading producer of many of the resources, whether it's copper, gold, oil, and so on. And yet, it's a small fraction of the world's trade. It's about 16% of the world's population, but less than 2%. So my question was, is it unilaterally or a complete positive that China is coming into Africa? And you've heard from my comments this evening that there are clearly challenges to China's approach, but my conclusion is that on balance, there are significant benefits to be had for having the Chinese do what they're doing around resources. However, a better outcome would be if the United States were more engaged, the United States, but many other countries in the world, were more engaged in a more cohesive and a coordinated approach to the resource question. So I hope that really is the takeaway from this discussion.
And please, if you want to know about specifics and details, her books are available right near the door. Shall we open the floor up to questions? You have a mic?
Thank you. I enjoyed the framing of your talk. I was just wondering if you've been seeing anything. The Pew Research, as you were saying, was from 2007. And I was actually in Washington, D.C. last summer, and I spent a lot of time in the taxi cabs talking to Ethiopians and Somali taxi drivers about what was going on. on the ground because they send their money back, obviously, to support their families. And I think what I've heard, and I heard it from a development director that I talked to last week who runs village enterprises in Kenya, which is there was this short-term joy, basically. Africa, in Africa, the Chinese were coming in, they were investing, right? But now what's happening is sort of it's coming back to bite them, because what they thought is people sold their best arable land and they got very good prices. But what's happening now is it's the breadbasket of Africa is disappearing because the Chinese are growing crops on these lands, and those crops and that food is not for Africans, but it's being transported. Food is not for Africans, but it's being transported back to China for the Chinese. And so now, actually, that's what I was experiencing was a lot of upset and a lot of concern about. For a short-term gain, you now have a long-term consequence, and I think that's kind of something to think about. And then the other piece is, of course, that the overlay in China with the water issue, of course, is global climate change. And there's no snow that has fallen on the glaciers since 1950s. So what's happening is that there's going to be a short-term major kind of melting, as we know, the melting of the Himalayan glaciers, followed by a long-term drought. And the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau supports water for 2 billion people on the planet. And there's water for not just 1.3 billion Chinese, but obviously the 10 downstream countries and hundreds of millions of other people like Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia. So I think that, it's the water shortage is going to drive a very complex piece, which is not just about water wars. I mean, yes, the Chinese are doing their best to retain water up on their own plateau. They've built 10,000 dams to retain the water on the plateau. So it is enormously complex, and I think, like you, it's going to rapidly come. These issues are coming much and much more prevalent, and it's quite concerning, I think. And I think your book's very timely, and I really appreciate what you've done. Thank you.
So thank you very much for your comments, and I really do appreciate what you said. In terms of your first point, I think there are a couple of things that strike me. First of all, the broader point is that you are seeing that the regulatory environment is changing quite rapidly. So in many African countries, you actually cannot buy land, and actually this is true in Brazil. You now can get leaseholds. You cannot actually, and Zimbabwe is a classic example. The whole unraveling in Zimbabwe is around issues of land. So you cannot actually own the land. You can own a lease on the land. But I think the more fundamental question that you're touching on, which actually links back to my first book, Dead Aid, is ultimately the relationship, the reason why we're so sensitive about the relationship of China, particularly in Africa, although China invests everywhere else in the world, is because we accept that there has to be an important and strong role. The reason why we're so sensitive about the relationship of China, particularly in Africa, although China invests everywhere else in the world, is because we accept that there has to be an important and strong role of government. And government has to police, government has to be incentivized to do the right thing. Unfortunately, for many, many decades, African policymakers have been incentivized to do nothing and to abdicate their responsibilities. And I do talk a little bit about this in this book, but also in my past books. But government role, to my mind, is very clear. Governments have a responsibility to provide public goods, things like education and healthcare, infrastructure, and national security. Think about the way you live in the United States. Maybe healthcare is a bit of a contentious issue here, I know, but everything else, you expect that the government is going to provide those things. The second thing is government is supposed to regulate. You expect the government to regulate. They're supposed to police bad behavior. They're supposed to ensure that illegal behavior is punished. The whole essence of the problem around the financial crisis, or why it was such a why it's been exacerbated as a problem, has been because of the failure of governments to do their job in regulation. And then the third important piece is that the government is supposed to incentivize good behavior. They're supposed to create a policy environment that encourages us to do the right thing. If you look across Africa, there are serious vulnerabilities on these three things. On the first point, public goods are actually provided by the international agencies, or have been traditionally. So I usually very flippantly say you have USAID providing education, Bill Gates Foundation providing health care, the Chinese providing infrastructure, the UN providing national security. Well, then what is the role of the government? Things like regulation are incredibly important. The fact that people can be worried about the Chinese coming into a country, growing crops and exporting them while people in those countries are starving, that to me is a failure of government. And of course, issues around incentives and getting people to do the right thing. It's not in these countries, not just about the people, the average person and the average taxpayer. It's also mainly about government being incentivized to do the right thing. And I have written extensively, Dead Aid was really about that, the fact that the aid system actually incentivized government to do the wrong thing. If you will indulge me for just very quickly, I'll just explain why that is the case. You think about the democratic contract as it exists in the United States. You have an implicit contract with your government. Your government says to you, I'm going to tax you, and in return for those taxes, I'm going to give you this suite of public goods. I'm going to give you education. I'm going to give you national security. I'm going to give you, incentivize you to get jobs and so on. If the government fails to deliver on that, you vote them out. So they get fired. Every 4 years, you have an election. And that sanctity of that contract is critical for the democratic process to work. In a place like Africa and many other places around the world, the fact that the government does not rely on the taxpayer to stay in office is the problem. So the aid system basically creates a schism or severs the relationship between the taxpayer and the government. And therefore, our governments in Africa very rationally spend their time courting and catering to the donors and have no time or interest for the taxpayer. Fortunately, and this is every cloud has a silver lining, the cliche actually works here, but fortunately the financial crisis, I believe, has been a fantastic opportunity for African governments to become more accountable. They cannot go to Italy now and say, oh gosh, do you mind sorting out our healthcare problem? Italy's got its own problems. The United States has its own problems, and it absolutely makes no sense for the United States to continue borrowing massive amounts of money from China in order to give aid to Africa. It makes no sense whatsoever. And so because I think the logic is being taken, the sort of logic that has been the the standard by which the world has operated in the past 30 years, that standard is being challenged because the donors, traditional donors, don't have money. I think there's a real opportunity here for African governments to be held accountable. There is a way to go, but I do believe that the Chinese system of investing in these economies and expecting something in return. The Chinese are not there for democracy or religion. They're there because they need access to resources. And that sort of callous or very clear motivation means that African governments and governments in South America, everywhere, are going to have to step up. And it's fantastic to be in Africa. In Zambia in particular, there have been skirmishes with the Chinese, but the Zambian population has stood up and said, we're absolutely not going to tolerate this, and the government has had to act in a way that I have never seen as somebody who was born in Zambia and seen the country over the past 45 years develop. And so it's a long-winded way of saying there are significant problems and weaknesses in the public policy in these emerging markets, mainly because of the historical context of them getting a free pass. That is changing very dramatically. Governments are going to have to respond. And as I said, Brazil is a very good example of this. The relationship is dynamic and changing. African governments are going to have to respond to their local populations. And so although there are worries about where the food is going and so on, I think to the extent that governments become more active, inadvertently have to become more active, I think you will see much more action on the ground. To your point about climate change, very quickly, to be very candid, environmental issues are not my sort of strength. It's not my big area. I will say this is a big, big problem. It's one of the classic difficult problems that an emerging market country is facing. What is more important? People to survive, to be fed. GM foods is a good example. What's more important? Do we want to feed people so that they can survive? Or are we so concerned about GM foods to the extent that people will die because we think GM is so bad? The sort of flippant comments in the book was the Chinese in Copenhagen when they had a meeting with in the United States about the environmental concerns, and they were asked to reduce the amount of pollution, and they complained and said, listen, you were polluting as you became industrialized. Why are you giving us grief? And the sort of general consensus at the end of the meeting was that the Chinese said, okay, we will reduce our pollution, but we will not promise to cut back on our pollution dramatically. We promise to pollute only as much as you pollute. And so there's this more fundamental issues going on, but good points all the same. Sorry about that.
Hello, my name is Samir, and thank you for the PowerPoints, by the way. I was praying we would have some of this. But, so 2 questions that I've been thinking about. And so I understand why the Chinese would invest $9 billion to build a railroad in Nigeria, or invest a couple of $1 billion to build highways in Ethiopia. But I really did not understand why they gave $200 million to the African Union to build their headquarters. I've thought about it. I'm trying to think about, well, the African Union doesn't own any mine, they don't own any land, and you just said that they're always investing to get something back. So what are they trying to get back from the African Union? And my second question has to do with, you gave us an example of how they can come in and bid $500 for that podium. And so lately, the IMF, the US, has been trying to get China to change the exchange rate, given that they have a fixed exchange rate and they haven't changing it. So do you think that if they evaluate the currency, they would not be able to bid that high on these mines they do already, even though they'll have a high utility, but that utility has to be constrained to the budget constraint? So if the exchange rates change, so that's going to draw on the foreign reserve. So is that going to help them not be able to bid on all these investments? Thank you.
So I think I'm getting the signal that we're running out of time, so let me answer you very quickly. On the first point, why would they give money to the AU? Well, the AU is basically member states, representatives of member states. I think you need to look behind the curtain, and behind the curtain is a number of governments, heads of state representing their countries, and to me it's a smooth passage when the Chinese show good faith, good intentions by saying, hey, we are your friends. And by the way, they are investing very heavily in Ethiopia in any case. I don't see what the benefit to the Zambian is that they're building a huge building in Addis Ababa. But you can see in Addis Ababa, if you go to Addis Ababa, it's the significant infrastructure build out there is a plus. But I do think a big, nice, shiny building where all the African heads of state have meetings, well, that's not so bad. And a few years ago they flew all the African presidents to Beijing. Huge fanfare. I mean, it was completely over the top. They imported giraffes and elephants, and I mean, they just went completely over. You could argue this is a bit insane, but they wanted to give you the welcome home feel. And so I do think that these are things that these countries do to make you feel much more sort of loved. On the exchange rate, I think that your question is very valid if China were operating in the frame of mind or the economic state of mind that we operate in Western thought. That's not how they operate. This is a state capitalist system. This whole idea of exchange rate, interest rates. Last week when there was this cut in the interest rates in China, all the markets, oh my goodness, it's a big stimulus. How many people in China have bank accounts? As a proportion of the country, it's a very small number. And so you cannot look at the Chinese actions, I think, in that lens. I understand your question, and I think if you were talking about Europe, you would be right that there would be significant knock-on effects of revaluing their currency on how much they would be willing to pay for an asset. But I just think that the Chinese approach is very different. When people are worried about whether China is going to crash, is it going to be a hard landing? Why wouldn't the Chinese just start printing money? Well, they'll do anything possible to stave off political uncertainty. And we have to change our own mindset and understand that these governments are not constrained in the manner in which we are. And just my last point about the exchange rate. I know that in the US in particular, people spend countless hours criticizing the Chinese. Oh, they're cheating. Even today, Mitt Romney and President Obama were in Ohio. I heard this comment come up. Oh, you know, the Chinese, they're playing unfair. Well, you know what? I'm sorry to say, the US plays incredibly unfair in farm subsidies where Africa is concerned. So, as they say on airplanes, put your own gas mask on before trying to assist others.
Perhaps one last question. Right. Because what happens is CNN is going to turn off. I mean, C-SPAN is going to turn off.
Oh,
So
did
the
I
lights
say
will
that
go-
on C-SPAN? I didn't mean to offend anybody.
Hey, hello, and thank you for your excellent presentation here. That was quite a bit of information packed in, and it was actually quantitative, so that was good. The chart that really kind of got my ticker going was the GDP growth over time, kind of that long picture there, and thinking, you know, what would the real GDP deflator look like on that? Because obviously, you know, we're in a very monetary policy driven type of environment. Obviously, the inflation kind of environment we're in is going to have a huge impact, considering we're in a resource-constrained world now. So anytime, you know, any nation with a printing press is basically exporting inflation to China, yes, they can print, you know, their own renminbi to control it. But what do you have to say about sort of these record gold inflows and sort of the Chinese citizens? Like you said, they don't have bank accounts, but they do have a very long history of, you know, holding gold, holding silver, holding precious metals. Do you think at some point they're going to succeed in being able to basically make the renminbi either decoupled from the dollar or potentially the next reserve currency? Do you think they're going to succeed with that? And do you think that you know, that they're going to be able to keep the GDP deflator under control over time, because, you know, you've got that relationship between GDP growth and unemployment. And if that gets out of control, they're going to have, you know, political issues at home to deal with. So, I mean, what do you think about China's monetary policy going forward?
So once again, I mean, I love these type of questions because it kind of bolsters my, I'm so glad I spent time going to school point of view. But then the fact of the matter is that in the real world, it's a completely different ballgame. And so everything you've just said completely applies to a Western economy that runs with very deep monetary, very deep monetary tools. People with bank accounts, you change the interest rate, the mortgage market it responds immediately. That's not China, and China's got a long, long way to go. Now, is it their hope, or are they acting to become a reserve currency to decouple or to remove themselves from the vulnerabilities of relying on other currencies? Yes, I would say that is true. If you look at reserves accumulated not just by China, but by India, by Brazil, these big economies on the emerging markets, they are increasing their amount of holdings, not just in terms of reserves, but in terms of the assets, whether it's gold assets, whether it's resource assets in terms of proper land assets around the world. I think part of that, a large part of that, is that they don't want to rely on the IMF. They don't want to rely on the SDR system or the US for bailouts. And so very significantly, there is this shift away from that. I do think also there is a sort of decoupling or a schism emerging between the emerging and developed economies. You've heard of the BRICS Bank. In the book, I talk a lot about some of the swaps that China is doing, using the renminbi much more than relying on Western currencies, and particularly the dollar. I don't think that that's going to happen in great extent very soon, because the sort of financial infrastructure that's required to have a reserve currency, China's way off from that. But to say that they are moving in that general direction, I think is probably is pretty accurate.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Moyo for her insightful